Good evening. I'm Anna Danziger Halperin, Associate Director of the Center for Women's History at New York Historical Society. I'm joined today by my colleague and curatorial scholar in women's history, Karen Van Horen. Before we begin our presentation, I would like to thank our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all our members and other generous donors. Your support allows New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission. The New York Historical Society is currently open on Tuesday through Sunday, so reserve your timed entry tickets on our website. Before we launch into our program, I want to let you know that it will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. We have disabled the chat function, so please do make sure to use the Q&A. After the presentation, we will get to as many questions as time allows. So tonight we're here to talk about the Salem Witch Trials, Reckoning and Reclaiming. And the Center for Women's History has been absolutely thrilled to bring this exhibit to our museum from the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, just in time for Halloween, as well as the 330th anniversary of the Salem Witch Trials. The exhibition is not only about the story of the witch trials themselves, the 1692 events that are a defining example of injustice and intolerance in American history, but it's also a story about how we tell that story. And so as we'll get into the presentation, the exhibit not only talks about the trials, but features two artistic responses by contemporary artists who are descendants of those impacted in Salem. So if we go to the next slide, the first thing our visitors see when they walk into the gallery is a black room with projections of words on the wall that you can see here. This is just a still. And these words are drawn from the court documents, from the witch trials themselves. The Salem witch trials began in the winter of 1692 after a few young girls in Salem began to experience symptoms that seemed unexplainable to Salem residents at the time. The first legal proceedings began in March of 1692, and by October of that year, only about 6 months, 19 individuals had been hanged, one more killed by being pressed to death, and 5 more died in legal custody. These court documents are rare documents, and we pulled out some of the words from them for this projection so that it would help us set the tone for the exhibit itself. And next slide. One of the things that we added to the exhibit is some elements from our own collections to put the Salem events in a broader historical context. So what you see here are 2 documents from our library collections and 1 painting. And these help us show the context in which the Salem witch trials took place. Between about 1400 and 1800, there were witch trials all across Europe and colonial America. The title that you see on your left, Malleus Maleficarum, is sometimes referred to as the Hammer of Witches, and it's really a notorious book that was originally published in 1486 by a German inquisitor who was a member of the Catholic Church. And this book was really a step-by-step guide to how to find, persecute, kill, and torture women who were suspected of witchcraft. A witch during this period was thought to be someone who was serving the devil. And the painting that you see on your right shows what some of the imagery of the time associated with witchcraft. Witches were overwhelmingly considered to be women, and they were associated with things like boiling pots, animal skulls, and other sort of symbols of the occult that we'll return to when we talk to about some of our contemporary artistic responses. On the next slide, We also felt that it was crucial to bring in the story of Tituba. This exhibit is being put on by the Center for Women's History, and we really wanted to tell Tituba's story as a way of reflecting that. So Tituba was an enslaved woman working in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, who was the um, clergyman of Salem Village, where the original trials, the first accusations took place. Samuel Parris brought Tituba over to Massachusetts from Barbados. It's often the historical memory of Tituba is that she was Black. Our historical evidence, the best historical evidence is that she was actually of Indigenous descent. And so that's why we display this map of Barbados in the exhibit as well. Tituba is often thought of as sort of the original witch of the Salem witch trials. Young girls, including Samuel Parris's daughter Betty and his niece Abigail Williams, who lived in the household with Tituba, were two of the original girls to experience these mysterious afflictions. There's the only evidence that Tituba was involved in any kind of magic is that a neighbor asked her to bake a witch cake in over a hearth like the one that you see on the left side of your screen to help determine the identity of the whatever witch was harming the girls. So Tituba, as instructed, baked a witch cake combining the girls' urine with rye meal, feeding the mixture to a dog, and that was supposed to tell the identity of who was harming the girls. The girls watched in horror, looked on to this ritual, and accused Tituba. The Salem witch trials might have ended there with the accusations against Tituba, as well as two other ostracized women in the community, one who was a um, poor beggar and the other who was an older woman who had scandalized the community by marrying someone below her social station. But Tituba, in the examination that you see, this handwritten court document on the right side of your screen, confessed. We now think of her confession as a survival mechanism. She was able to outlive the trials by confessing rather than being hanged herself. But in her confession, she said there were multiple witches at work in Salem, and thus began the chaos of members of the community being accused. By the end of those 6 months, more than 200 people had been accused of witchcraft. Next slide. Looking into our second section, we begin to look at objects, original objects, as well as reproductions of court documents that belonged to people who lived in Salem, accusers and the accused, neighbors who defended those who were accused of practicing witchcraft, as well as religious authorities and magistrates, legal authorities. So the first object that you see, and you can see it dramatically displayed here, having a shadow cast on the floor, is a window that hung in the home of the Town family. There are very few families that were as severely impacted by the events in Salem as the Town family. There were three Town sisters, Rebecca Nurse, Mary Esty, and Sarah Cloyce, who were all matriarchs in the Salem community, well-respected women who had large families, large loving families. They were members of the church. They were thought of as really community leaders. But despite their stature, they were all accused of witchcraft. And this is where we see the accusations spread from women like Tituba, who were at the margins of Salem society, to those who were much more well placed within the community. Only Sarah Cloyce survived. Next slide. This loom that you see on the left belonged to Rebecca Putnam, who was a member of the Putnam family. The Putnams were the ones who accused Rebecca Nurse and many other Salem residents. They were a major family pushing for the trials, of course, pushing for more and more accusations and accusing more and more people. But what's so fascinating about this loom is that if you look closely at the handle, there are symbols carved into it, things like daisy wheels and a human face and hearts and crosses. And while some of these symbols may be representative of Christianity, other symbols we can look at as representing um, counter magic, protective spells to protect the holder of this loom. And so even within this family that was a major force accusing their neighbors, we see a countercurrent of belief. We also have on display in this section this brass sundial belonging to John Proctor. It stood outside the home of John and Elizabeth Proctor. They were both also accused. John was very beloved by his community. This is a luxury item. He was quite wealthy, but that didn't save him from being executed. Elizabeth only survived because she was pregnant at the time of the trials and granted a stay of execution. Her baby was born in jail, and she was managed to outlast the trials and was let go in 1693. Next slide. We also, in this section, begin to tell the story of how we tell the story of Salem, even in the immediate aftermath. So the two documents that you see in the center and at the right, the printed documents, come from our library collections, and they are pamphlets by the father and son clergymen, Increase and Cotton Mather, who were religious authorities at the time, very well connected political allies of the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And these pamphlets we can see as really apologizing for the trials themselves in some ways and giving political cover to them. So the trials themselves came to an abrupt halt in October of 1693 after a series of petitions calling for the governor to end the trials. This is after 19 individuals had already been hanged, including John Proctor was among the last of them to be hanged. And there's really widespread chaos throughout the region, throughout the colony. And so the Mathers, in their instructions to their religious flocks that we see in these pamphlets, condemn the use of spectral evidence in the trial, that is the use of visions and invisible testimony, things that can't be seen, that there's no tangible evidence of. But they say that the trials were just, the executions were just because witches were the embodiment of evil. On the left is a very different take, and also a immediate reflection on the trials. It's a document by the Reverend Francis Dane Sr., who in 1693 reflected on the trials and really powerfully laments the way that the community turned on one another. Dane was one of the courageous souls calling on the governor to put a stop to the trials in October of 1693. And he says in this, our sin of ignorance, wherein we knew we did wrong, will not excuse us. Or that's a rough paraphrasing, but he's calling on the community to look at how they had turned on each other and how misfortunate this was that they did. It calls on them to do better. So now I'll turn it back to my colleague Karen to tell you about the artistic responses to the trials.
Good evening, everyone. So the next section is one of the two reclamation stories that Anna mentioned. This one focuses on the late designer, Alexander McQueen. If we could also get the next slide, please, who in 2006 learned that his ancestor, Elizabeth Howe, was executed during the Salem Witch Trials. So in this section, we look at his fall-winter 2007 collection that he designed in her memory, as well as the story of Elizabeth Howe herself and how she came to be accused. In 2006, Alexander McQueen traveled to Salem with Sarah Burton, then his assistant and now the creative director of the house, and Sarah Moore from British Folk, to learn more about Howe's life and her execution. They worked together with local historians and institutions, and the research resulted in a collection in memory of Elizabeth Howe, Salem 1692. It was not a very well-received runway show. Some critics, including Moore herself, who writes in Vogue, criticizing the theatrics of the show, saying that it was really hard to see the clothes. But for us, we actually drew inspiration from those theatric, from this dramatic set design, to design our own gallery space, including the pentagram on the floor, which was the centerpiece of this runway show. On the runway, McQueen also had an inverted pyramid with projections of skulls and flame on each facet. And to evoke that feeling, we have a large-scale reproduction of one of the looks from the collection that is sort of like doubled and mirrored. And it's a dress, you can see it in the back behind the glass case. It's a dress that featured embroidered pattern that resembles flames or fire, as well as locks of hair. And it's possibly a reference to the practice of shearing the hair of women accused of witchcraft before they were executed. So the dress that you see here in the case is displayed in the gallery alongside large reproductions of additional books from the collection. We can have the next slide. McQueen openly spoke about being a sexual assault survivor, and he draws inspiration from historical figures who were themselves victimized, and he is looking to empower them with the clothes that he designs, creating a kind of protective armor, if you will. And he does that with leather bodices, oversized jewelry that can double as weapons, and strong silhouettes like bold shoulders and structured skirts. And as his career developed, these become signature design elements that he keeps coming back to again and again and again. And we could see in this collection the depth of McQueen's research. For example, we highlight the headpieces designed by his longtime collaborator, Sean Lean, of the moon and the star, and you can see them on the right side. The dress that we have on the display was worn with the star headpiece. The moon in particular is associated with the goddess Diana, a figure that often appears in 16th and 17th century imagery as linked to witchcraft, representing witches. And both the moon and the star are cards in the tarot cards, which are important to many present-day practitioners of witchcraft. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in our next section. And the collection also includes a bag with a bird claw. And although bird claws were often used as protective amulets, several of the accused, including Tituba that we mentioned at the beginning, said that the devil appeared to them in the form of a bird. If we could have the next slide, I'll tell you that McQueen's ancestor, Elizabeth Howe, was a mother of 6 who lived outside of Salem on a farm with her husband, Weaver. And as the witch panic expanded beyond Salem village, neighbors dug out all disputes as evidence of witchcraft. And in 1692, following a decade-long dispute between Elizabeth Howe and her neighbors, Samuel and Ruth Purley, Howe is being accused of bewitching their then 10-year-old daughter. In total, 24 people come and testify against her. At the same time, 13 people speak in her defense. Sadly, it doesn't help, and she refuses to admit guilt. leading to her execution in July of 1692. There are several things that are stand out about her case. And the main one is that her record is very much complete, unusually complete. And on display, we have 12 documents that trace her entire ordeal, beginning in May 1692 with the first complaint about her, the first time that her name appears in record. And interesting that the complaint about her includes some blank spaces, which lead researchers to believe that the accuser didn't actually know her, didn't actually name her, and her name was added after. We also have different testimonies against her, including accusing her of inflicting witchcraft on Mary Welcott, as well as on random farm animals, and then through her execution. And eventually, a couple of decades later, after her death, she, in 1711, was exonerated, and that was granted to her daughters. With that, we'll move to our second reclamation story. If I could have the next slide, of photographer Frances Denny, who in 2014 discovered that she too was descended from someone embroiled in the witch trials. Her ancestor was Samuel Sewell, one of the 9 judges in the Salem trials. That led her to the project, which became Major Arcana, documentation of self-identified present-day witches. She photographed and interviewed 75 modern individuals across the United States, spiritual healers, shamans, Wiccan high priestesses, neo-pagans, mystics, herbalists, and activists. If we can get the next slide, please. The name of the project, Major Arcana, refers to the central cards in the tarot deck, 22 central cards. And many of the witches, as I mentioned in the previous section, reference the visually rich symbolism of the cards as a gateway into their practice, as a sort of portal. And you can even see on the screen, the moon, as I mentioned, is included in the tarot cards. And this gave Anna and I an opportunity to highlight our own collection of historical tarot decks, including the one that you're seeing on the screen, which dates to 1860 Switzerland. And I'll just mention briefly that tarot cards started in Italy, and they only acquired their kind of occult and esoteric meanings in the 18th century when they start spreading to France, and then from that to the rest of Europe. In addition to the structure in the center of the gallery that you've seen in the previous slide, and now we'll move to the next slide, that features 6 of the portraits. The other addition that we have to the original show that we are particularly excited about is an audio component that allows us to not only show the different faces of witches today, but to also let them be heard in their own voice, their own words. We recorded several of the individuals whose portraits are in the show, and these recordings are played as ambient sound in the gallery, but we also have a QR code that visitors can scan and hear on their headphones and their own devices, and also read the texts. And Denny's book raises the question, who defines witch? And what does practicing witchcraft mean today? And the photographs alongside these new recordings we made show that each of these individuals reclaim the title of witch on their own terms, subverting the taboos around witches in favor of a much more complex, much more diverse, a much more holistic state of being rooted in spiritual traditions, as well as admiration for nature. And if we can have the next slide, you'll see some other of Denny's beautiful portraits. They're accompanied by texts written by the subjects, allowing each of them to express in their own words the different meanings of reclaiming witch today. And these words allow us to see how their own brand of witch often sits on the intersection of other parts of their identity, and we'll play one clip for you.
My brand of witchcraft is my own, a wild, eclectic brew of hoodoo, Black, indigenous folk spirituality, and shamanism. I am a solitary witch, and the woods are my church. I pray in nature and use the elements to heighten my rituals and ceremonies. I use tools such as drums, rattles, animal bones, feathers, crystals, and sigils, and I channel animal spirits, spirit guides, and ancestors. I pray with my full body and spirit, not on my knees.
Thank you. And these words are from Shine Blackhawk, which you can see on the right side. And with that, I'll give it back to Anna to tell you about our reflection section.
Thank you so much, Karen. So on the next slide, there's an inherent tension in the show where with the people who were impacted by the events in 1692 in Salem, we emphasize that these were real people. The accused themselves would not have identified themselves as witches. The accusations against them were false. This is an instance of grave injustice against them that really ruined their lives, and in some cases took their lives for those who were killed, but even for others who were accused, they were incredibly damaging to their reputations and their livelihoods. McQueen and Denny, on the other hand, are reclaiming the label of witch. McQueen is really leaning into some of the stereotypical archetypal imagery of witchcraft. And Denny is showing the multiplicity, the diversity of contemporary witch identities. And in some cases, the many long-rooted traditions that they're laying claim to. So in our conclusion, which is different than the way that Peabody Essex concluded the exhibit, we really wanted to provoke our visitors to think about what they take away from this juxtaposition and to also rethink how they first learned about the Salem Witch Trials. Because over the past 330 years, there have been countless artistic and literary and pop culture representations of the story. And this really reflects the hold that Salem has on our collective consciousness. Some of these versions of the story reclaim the dignity of the accused, like the ones that we've highlighted, but others vilify witchcraft and lean into some of the damaging stereotypes. Generations of women's rights advocates have pointed to witch hunts as tools of oppressing women throughout history who dare challenge gender roles. So each of these different representations tells the story anew for its own moment, with yet interpretation really reflecting the creator's own vision of perception of women's authority in society. So in this section, we show some examples of these representations. I think most commonly people tend to associate Arthur Miller's play The Crucible with the Salem Witch Trials. So we have a movie still that you can see on your right alongside other movie stills from other TV and media film representations of the story. We also have a painting from our own collection that you can see on the left, which is called the Salem Martyr, Witch Hill. And we really want to provoke our visitors to thinking about, what kinds of stereotypes or false narratives they're carrying with them, and to think about how they'll tell the story going forward. And I almost forgot to tell you about my favorite one of these reflections, which is in the center. And you probably can't read this, but this is a handwritten poem by the poet Emily Dickinson. And it reads, "Witchcraft was hung in history, but history and I find all the witchcraft that we need around us every day." And I think that sort of sentiment of finding magic around us and defying the oppression of those accused of witchcraft really fits well with the themes that we can glean from Denny's portraits. We also want to provoke our visitors into thinking about their own roles in contemporary moments of crisis. I think the reason why Salem has this hold on us and why people like Arthur Miller return to the story in his own moment of McCarthyism, for example, is that this instance of a community turning on each other, turning on members, family members turning against family members, neighbors against neighbors, is really a cautionary tale for ourselves. So we want our visitors to walk away thinking about how, what role will they play in moments of injustice that they face in their lives. On the next slide, we also end the exhibit returning to the tarot, this example of everyday magic that one can reclaim for themselves by with this social media niche interactive and immersive space that we developed, where we took some of the symbols of tarot cards and turned them into magnets. So visitors can make their own tarot card and pose with it. And we have figures of death and temperance next to it as well, that for people to really play with and explore the ideas. We also have in this section, this deck is from 1860s Switzerland, as Karen mentioned earlier, but we also have a screen where you can see decks, 4 different decks from our library collections that are historical tarot decks, ranging from 1760s France to, this is the most recent of them, this 1860 deck. So with that, we will turn to any questions that you may have. And as a reminder, again, you can ask questions in the Q&A function, not through the chat, but through the Q&A. So here's one question. Are there any interesting details that you learned about the trials that didn't get included in the show? Ooh. I think one thing that we had to take out of the show for space that's really interesting is some of the geography of the original accusations themselves. So the first accusations were in Salem Village, which is actually contemporary Danvers, not Salem, the town itself, which is slightly inland. Salem is right on the coast. And then, so the original accusations were in this more rural sort of offshoot of Salem. But as the accusations spread, they really spread all across the region. Karen, is there anything else that we learned that we didn't get to include?
I don't think so. I think you covered it.
Yeah. That geography is really interesting, but we didn't have space to show that. Here's a factual question. Who was the governor of the colony at the time of the trial? His name was William Phipps. Here's another one. Is it known whether there were self-identified witches around the time of the trials, and when in history? And also, what about Macbeth's witches? So answering the second part, Macbeth's witches, Shakespeare lived earlier in the 1500s. So this is after Macbeth by over a century. And it's whether people were self-identified witches is a tricky question. This is actually something where we differ with our colleagues at the Peabody Essex Museum, who really adamantly insist there were no witches in 1692. Um, we hesitate to say that so categorically because there is this tradition of people claiming their genealogies of traditions that go back to this time. Um, but witch in that puritanical sense of this is someone, usually a woman, who is serving the devil to unleash harmful magic. No, none of the falsely accused would have identified as witches. Karen, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we kind of contend with in this exhibition. We really are trying to unpack a little bit the meaning of witch, and showing how during the Salem Witch Trial, it was used in a very oppressive way, whereas the individuals portrayed in Francis Denny's project kind of reclaim that on their own terms, really using that to empower and reconnect to traditions that events like the trials may have oppressed. So knowledge that would pass from generation to generation, knowledge about using certain herbs or certain traditions, Native American knowledge that would have been passed down. So we are really inviting the visitors to kind of sit a little bit with that discomfort, and reflect about that question: what is a witch?
Exactly. And also with there's been generations of women's historians really who've pointed to this women who were healers, or what might have been called wise women, were being accused of witchcraft because they were challenging male medical and religious authorities at the time with their own sources of knowledge. So a lot of people are familiar with the 1970s book, Witches, Midwives, and Nurse. I'm going to mess it up. Witches, Nurses, and Midwives. I'm going to mess up that order, by Barbara Ehrenreich, who just passed away, and Deirdre English. It was really fundamental text of the feminist movement and the women's health movement of the 1970s. But actually, even before they wrote that, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was a suffragist, wrote a book in 1893 called Woman, Church, and State that it makes similar allegations about why women were persecuted as witches, and blames Christianity and religious and male medical authorities for witch hunts. So there is that tradition of women pointing to women's knowledge being persecuted in this way.
And Anna, I also want to add, at the beginning of the presentation, Anna pointed out a small painting that we have in a collection that's included in the first section, from the 17th century, that depicts what we now associate with stereotypes about witches. And this is the time when those stereotypes are being solidified. And what you see, sort of like in the background of that painting, is an older woman kind of hunched over a boiling pot, suggesting to us that women that are putting together ingredients in the dark, older, lonely women, are kind of brewing some kind of bad magic, evil magic. And that is where a lot of the stereotypes then kind of dominate what happened in Salem and beyond are really starting to come together.
Yeah. So here's actually two different questions that I'm going to put together. Do you think some of the accusations were actually politically or economically motivated? And were local churches instrumental in the pursuit and prosecution frenzy? And the answer to all of that is yes, yes, and yes. Historians disagree about what caused the girls' original afflictions and why is this hysteria spread. It really seems like it's a confluence of an enormous amount of stresses. So there were political there was a lot of political uncertainty during the time. There actually wasn't a charter for the colony, which is part of why this court gets set up and then gets disbanded and then gets reset up again, in part of the legal history. And because there was a lot of political upheaval at the time, economically, one of the, we talked about Rebecca Nurse, who was one of the town sisters, and her animosity with her neighbors, the Putnams. We can sort of see that there are some property disputes that might be what is pushing for some of these accusations against from neighbor to neighbor, if they have long-standing disputes that are economically motivated. Also, people like Philip and Mary English were both accused of witchcraft. Then they were quite prosperous, as well as John Proctor was quite prosperous. So we could see some sort of class antagonism there. Philip English also spoke French. He was from Jersey, which was part of England at the time, but a French-speaking part of England. And the fact that he spoke French made him a target of suspicion, because the French and the British were, at war at the time. There's a lot of those who experienced afflictions were refugees in the community of Salem, having come from other parts of New England where there were battles among the British and French allied colonists, as well as indigenous allied allies of the French. And so they came to Salem with an experience of trauma. And then also the local church was quite instrumental, right? This started in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. Parris himself was having tension in the community. He was giving sort of increasingly conspiratorial kinds of sermons as he was having fights with the community about his own pay. And so some of the era of conspiracy and conspiratorial thinking was really prevalent in his home. He was giving these sermons about how there's evil lurking in the community even before the girls began to experience afflictions. So it's really just this massive confluence of factors. Karen, do you want to have anything to add about? Yeah, the how and why is one of the trickiest questions, I think, about Salem, because it is sort of yes and yes and yes and there's so many different factors that led to this outrageous spread of accusations.
It's maybe also worth to add that the people in Salem already, as a community, when they came to the colonies, were oppressed in England. Before they came, they were already felt very hunted, and were very religious people who believed in another world where there is a devil kind of lurking that could disguise as regular people. And so there was a lot of fear. There were also there was shortage of timber during that time period, which made it very hard to warm up homes. They were attacks by French and French allied Native Americans on certain parts of Salem and neighboring towns and farms. So there's already a lot going on in the community.
Absolutely. Another question is, were those accused overwhelmingly women? And yes, absolutely. The Salem trials differed from many different similar trials in colonial America and in Europe, where they started, by the fact that there were so many men accused. Of those who were hanged, though, I believe the number is that there were 6 men and 13 women who were hanged, and so something like 80% of all of the accusations were against women. But I don't have the exact numbers of the huge amount of people who are accused. There's, I think, time for 2 more quick questions. One of them is where any reparations sought by the family of those wrongly accused and executed. And yes, so as Karen mentioned when we were talking about Elizabeth Howe's case, which is exceptionally well documented in the archives, beginning in 1796, family members of those who were accused began to petition the government to exonerate those who had been accused. And in 1711, the legislature of Massachusetts Bay Colony did exonerate those who had been um, convicted. And there was monetary compensation made, restitution for relatives like Abigail and Mary Howe, who were Elizabeth Howe's daughters. Apologies for the dog barking. One last question is, does the New York Historical Society have broader archival records that are available for research? And yes, we do. Our library is open to researchers, and you can visit our website to see that. And these documents are currently on display and can't be viewed in our reading room in the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library, but there are other documents that have to do with witchcraft that you can request and see, and other tarot decks that we don't have on display as well. So with that, we have unfortunately run out of time. Thank you so much for your participation and for your exceptional support of the New York Historical Society. We hope that you can come and see the Salem Witch Trials Reckoning and Reclaiming open in our Joyce B. Cowan Gallery for Women's History on the 4th floor of the museum. And it will be open through January 22nd, 2023. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.